Hello, I'm Ivory Abana Black, but you can call me Abana. I have here a book about Bronzeville, a once thriving African American community in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You know, I'm the author of this book, and I began learning about Bronzeville a long time ago as an anthropologist with Urban Anthropology, Inc. That's the organization that brings you these programs. The organization also developed a local documentary about African Americans. I'll be talking about African Americans in the United States and also in southeastern Wisconsin. I bet you don't know where we are right now. We're in Lower Walnut Street, a fabulous recreation of the main street of historic Bronzeville. And here, along the real Walnut Street, were hundreds of black-owned businesses. Can you get an idea by looking at some of the photos on the walls? Bronzeville existed until the middle of the 20th century. One thing you will learn about African Americans is that they really struggled to keep their communities together. But all too often, more powerful forces came in to break up their communities. Bronzeville was no exception. When the government decided to remove an area of the city to build a freeway and to bring in a program called urban renewal, they decided to tear down Bronzeville. Today, this community does not exist, except in the fond memories of those who once lived there. The senior citizens of Lapham Park Community Center decided to recreate their beloved Bronzeville in lower level of their center. Today we're going to talk about African American culture. But to understand how some black cultural traits developed, it is first necessary to understand the historical experiences of African Americans. Let's begin with the movement out of Africa. A few Africans began coming to America with some of the first explorers from Europe. That was way back in the 14 and the 1500s. But the big group of Africans came between the early 16 to the early 1800s. You may be surprised to know that those African areas were not all that different from life in most other parts of the world at the time. This includes America. In the 16 and 1700s in America, you had some people that lived in rural areas like mountains, and they lived in very simple houses that they built in a day or two. Here is an American log cabin built by many European groups that came to America. Most of these rural people had a few animals and a small garden where they grew just about everything that they needed. That was the same way it was in Africa in the countries or rural areas. They lived in a little house they built in a day or two, and most had gardens and a few animals as well. Here is an African dwelling. Both these Americans and Africans built their houses with materials they can find nearby, like long grasses and trees. In America in the 16 and 1700s, there were the beginnings of cities with their own governments and some very ornate and powerful armies that protected the area. And in West Africa, during the same time period, there were also cities. Two were the kingdom cities of Ashanti and Dahomey. Like America, these cities had their own governments, some ornate buildings, and large armies that protected them as well. These two African cities were often at war with neighbors and took prisoners. Some of the prisoners became slaves in Africa. The Europeans began buying these slaves and selling them to America. You might be wondering why America wanted to buy slaves. Well, in the southern areas of our country, a lot of white people had built plantations. Plantations are large farms that grew mostly just one crop, like tobacco or cotton, and these farms needed large numbers of workers. But when Africans were first brought to America, they didn't always have to work for slaves for life. They were most like servants than slaves, because most made agreements with their slave masters that they could be set free after a few years. A lot of white people also came from Europe as servants, and they also agreed to work for a number of years as well. But little by little, the plantation owners saw they needed more and more free workers. When all of the white servants had already finished their contracts, the slave traders began to bring over more and more Africans. Then a number of states in the South began to pass laws that Africans would have to become slaves for life. This was so that plantations could continue to make money for their owners. Can you just imagine what your life would be like if you had to be a slave for your entire life? But a lot of groups in America were working to free the slaves. Some, like the African people who are already free, began to develop something called the Underground Railroad. Some people helped bring the slaves to the freedom land of Canada. A lot of white groups really were against slavery, especially the people who lived in the North in the United States. The Germans and the Jews you learned about in the program were especially against slavery, and a very few will live in the South because of slavery. Other helping groups were the Quakers. Eventually, the North and the South fought the Civil War over slavery and some other issues. When the North won, the slaves were set free. After the war, it was somewhat easier for African Americans, but it was still very hard. Most slaves had never been allowed to read or write, and they didn't have many skills. Most ended up working for the same big farmers they had worked for before. These big farmers would let them use a little plot of land, and in return, they had to hand over a big share of the food they grew. This was called sharecropping. Besides being very poor, most of the African Americans in the South, as well as other states, were not allowed to get close to white people whenever they wanted to. Up into the 60s in the South, this door would either say whites only or colored people only. Often blacks couldn't sit next to whites or use their theaters, restaurants, hotels, or schools. This was called segregation. Besides the fact that African Americans had almost no opportunities, it also meant that African Americans didn't have much they can do to have fun in their free time. Do you see how the African Americans at this center invented a new Walnut Street when it no longer existed? Well, that's what African Americans always did. When they weren't allowed to do things that other Americans did, they invented their own things. Now, about the time we get into the 1900s, things would change for African Americans in America. In the North, you were beginning to have more businesses and industry than farming. And businesses and industry needed people to keep operating. At times, big cities in the North didn't have enough people to do the work that needed to be done. This especially happened during the World Wars, when so many men became soldiers and went off to Europe. Because of this, a lot of factory owners began to go to the South and bring up African Americans to work in the North. This became the period known as the Great Migration. In Milwaukee, the people that were brought here suffered their own form of segregation. They had to live in one area of the city, and that area would be known as Bronzeville. This area would grow and grow until it had hundreds of businesses and thousands of homes, and it would be famous for all of those things that African Americans had invented in the South. It is time to think about the kind of cultural traditions the African Americans in southeastern Wisconsin developed. It's now time to take a break and have your anthropologist get some ideas from you. Well, I'm back. I hope that you have given some serious thought to the kind of cultural traits you think our local African American community might have developed to help them in southeastern Wisconsin. You will now hear their ideas in their own words.
When I think of African American culture, I think of the blending of African culture and American culture as we now define it. Despite the fact that we've been in this country, African people or descendants of African people, for hundreds of years, there are still some values and traditions that have been carried down over those years. And when I think of the blending of the two cultures, for example, when we talk about the village in raising a child, we know traditionally in Africa that village was all of the people that lived there, the extended families. We've had that throughout our history in this country as well.
Many practices that are today considered Black American were brought over by indigenous Africans, then adapted to American life. Some of these practices are as basic as communicating and eating.
The griots of Africa were wise men, were musicians, were poets. That oral tradition of Africa was brought here. It was probably even maximized by the fact that it was illegal for the slaves to learn how to read and write, so they had to depend on their verbal communication.
Well, one thing I think that is unique about African American language styles is rhyming. Not so much unique, everyone rhymes. Poets are in every culture. But I do recall that as a kid, one of the things that we did was rhyme a lot. For instance, in playing Hide Spy, we would say, "Hide, spy, stick 'em in the eye, who's that stole my apple pie? Are you ready?"
And now you look at rap, and rap is really an evolution along the lines of the different ages, from the oral tradition of Africa to the need for slaves to communicate when they could not at times read and write, to the last poets, to the rappers. They're simply barriers of that tradition in modern times.
I think as you look at Black or African American culture, there are a myriad of differences between that of European or Asian or other types. But specifically when you look at church, there are some marked differences. The European culture uses something that's called count and measure. In other words, everything has a specific time and place. A church service starts at 9 o'clock and ends at 10, versus an African American style, which is affect or feeling. In many Black churches, if you ask what time the service ends, no one can tell you, because it's based on how long the preacher preaches or the choir sings.
A lot of the things that we now eat are native of Africa. And I think it's important that if you look at the migration from the South to the industrial North, a lot of people brought with them skills, and they also brought with them seeds and that sort of thing to the North so that they could eat some of the food that they were used to eating.
Food is a mixture of what our ancestors knew from Africa and what we had to deal with in the United States, and particularly in the South. And some very tasty products developed, such as the way we fix our greens, our cornbread, our black-eyed peas, how we make sweet potato pie.
Others we interviewed said Black culture is best explained through the ongoing response to social injustice, particularly racism in America.
In coming up here, most Black Americans, and that's why I say that instead of African Americans, we were more so involved in the civil rights movements, about fighting for our rights, for equal schools, equal everything, to be able to be equal here in America. And so the Black Americans focused on freedom here in America.
To some, the struggle of Blacks in America has defined African American culture in ways that indigenous Africans would not understand.
It was made apparent for me during a trip where I was at the African American Summit with Dr. Leon Sullivan, and the host hotel was putting on entertainment. Part of that entertainment ended up being a play by about Amos and Andy. And we found it very offensive as African Americans, and so there was this rumbling that started to go through the crowd as we began to hear what was going on in the theater, and as the people in blackface walked out. And when the indigenous African people were a little confused about what was going on and why we were starting to have this reaction. And so we had to explain to them that this was very offensive for us, coming from our experience as African Americans in this country. So that let me know that there is a culture that we have that's unique among any African people in the entire diaspora. We here in America have a culture.
African American culture developed in both ways, through an imaginative blending of ethnic traditions and the ongoing struggle for social justice in this country. What we shall see is that both forms of adaptation led to highly creative contributions by Black Americans in local and national communities. Anthropologists and sociologists such as Carol Stack and Robin Jarrett have long pointed out the strength of reciprocal exchange networks among African Americans, particularly among those of low income. Stack refers to the obligation to give and exchange as an underlying element of Black identity. Relatives and close friends are obligated to care for each other's children. The elderly rarely end up in institutions, and money and other resources are often loaned out on a moment-to-moment basis, according to need.
Being a single parent, childcare has always been an issue. When my kids were younger, childcare was really an issue, but when they got to school age, and it wasn't just having someone take care of them during the day. When I traveled, I would be gone for 2 and 3 days. And I was very fortunate and blessed that my mother, who's not around anymore, but was able to care for my children for those days I was out of town. I do have a lot of sisters, and they are also available to me. Sometimes I don't even ask their permission. I just take my daughter and just drop her off and speed off.
Among African Americans from all economic backgrounds, volunteering in the church and the community is an expected activity.
They're deacons in the churches. They're in the church organizations. They contribute to other people's education of their children. And in my day, in my youth, it was not unusual for a husband to die and his brother would adopt all his kids and raise them as his own. These kind of things have been going on forever.
This voluntary service extends beyond the local relationships. It is perhaps no coincidence that African American entrepreneurs and professionals have had strong success in the service industry, in consulting, military service, and service enterprises and agencies. In some cases, this niche was a result of being discriminatorily denied other options, and in other cases, it may have related to arrival times of Blacks in Milwaukee. Blacks in the city have struggled to own and operate enterprises in a wide range of sectors, from industry to financial institutions to retail markets to restaurants and restaurant chains. Clearly, there has been a creative thrust among African Americans to fill gaps in the service industry as opportunities arose. Blacks have led enterprises and services to businesses, to children and youth, to families, to neighborhoods, to the hospitality industry, to the sick and bereaved. Services including printing, cosmetology, cleaning, education, computers, catering, landscaping, automotive, home improvement, building, and daycare. African Americans have a vast inventory of traditions they can choose from when casting new cultural forms. They have practices carried over from Africa and practices borrowed from the scores of cultural groups they encountered in America. In addition, the racial barriers blacks have faced sometimes force them to be more creative than others in developing survival strategies. Strategies which themselves became cultural practices. In music, religion, art, dance, dress, celebrations, sports, games, and actual images of how to present oneself, how to be. Diverging social groups or subcultures have long been a part of African American life.
There are a lot of subcultures in the African American community. There are those that are organized and those that are not organized. Some of the organized ones might be like the Nation of Islam followers, different religious groups, Baptists, Methodists, Jehovah's Witnesses, different fraternities and sororities. There's also the educated and the non-educated. There's working class and the poor class, or those that are in poverty that only associate with those that are in poverty. There's work cultures. There's also, there might be a dark skin, light skin group that hang out.
A recent African American reinvention of self is hip-hop.
Now we come and we look at our young people of today, and I have found many of them are into this hip-hop culture, and it has affected many of our young people in a way, the clothes that they wear. Chains, the diamonds, want to drive the big cars, the language. There's actually a different language, like, yo, what's up? Up in there, you know, and the signs, not just gang signs and things and that, but everyone has a different means of greeting, and it's a language within itself that was created through hip-hop, what they called hip-hop, which is now considered an actual music. But you know, they look at hip-hop and they talk about, it's always about sex or how bad I am, or let's shoot this, let's kill this, but it's not all that. You also have gospel rappers that are out here and is just as popular as the regular R&B rap area, because you have gospel rappers that talk about heart and soul and feelings, but it's in a positive, motivational area.
I listen to music that, you know, might be offensive and might come off the wrong way, but then again, I also listen to gospel music and church music because that's a huge part of who I am, and I've grown up in the church all my life.
Black Americans here and elsewhere have engaged in ongoing, determined efforts to resist oppression, discrimination, and exploitation. At times, these efforts have been en masse, and at other times they have been the work of single individuals. In Milwaukee, this raw will to hold one's own ground, to effect policy change, was demonstrated by some of the community's earliest leaders, then on through the civil rights movement and beyond.
I remember the time the John Williamson family had purchased a home, maybe as the first blacks, at 12th and Capitol Drive, only to have some young white kids burn a cross in front of their home. And then some years later, in 1969, they bought a parade of homes, model homes, out in Waukesha County. And we also saw that with Zeddy Hyler in Wauwatosa, being the first black there, that house was vandalized, along with other prominent people who lived in Wauwatosa. But they all stood tall, and they have made very good contributions.
We had a wonderful experience with the Civil Rights era. It was exciting, it was dynamic, it was uniting in that we knew we were right. And that just had an energy behind it. We knew that racism was wrong. We knew that Jim Crowism was wrong. We knew it was wrong. to punish another people, a group of people, simply because of the color of their skin. I mean, it was biblical as well as philosophical. It was just right.
Let me tell you one thing that even affects me to this day. I was about 9 years old, and my grandmother took me with her to the March on Washington. We went to Washington, D.C. We stayed there waiting for this speech by this great man. We stayed in a little place they had put up with a fence around it and tents, and they called it Resurrection City, and ate surplus food. They ended up calling it Mud City because it rained so much that the tents couldn't stay up and they fell down, so they called it Mud City. But it was a place they had put for all these people that had migrated to come to this March on Washington to hear this great man. The man that we all came there to see was Dr. Martin Luther King. That was when he actually delivered the speech, I Had a Dream.
The black struggle against discrimination became a model for many other groups, both here in Milwaukee and nationally. Practices such as protests, peace marches, sit-ins, demonstrations, creating newsworthy events, policy forums, and the sacrifices of some individuals who risked their actual lives to defy the status quo were those later adopted by other groups facing discrimination, such as women, Latinos, Asians, American Indians, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and people living with disabilities. By developing and refining strategies to combat discrimination, blacks in all probability advanced social justice for every American.
Well, were you right? Did you figure out what cultural traits the local African Americans developed? Let's now return to your anthropologist. You remember from last time that the local African Americans talked about their culture. Well, now they're going to tell you something about the contributions they have made, not just to Wisconsin, but at times to the whole entire nation.
The three traits, voluntary service to others, reinvention of self, and the will to struggle, played roles in several movements and institutions founded in Milwaukee that have received national recognition. One of these is the Milwaukee Black Holocaust Museum, founded by Dr. James Cameron.
I had the privilege to go into the Jewish Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And it was in that museum that I was floored. I saw all the man's inhumanity to man that could ever be done to man in that museum, and they just tore me up inside. I told my wife when I came out there and composed myself, I said, honey, we need a museum like this in America to show what has happened to black people and freedom-loving white people who have been trying to help us ever since we've been in this country.
Another activity gaining national recognition and replication is Milwaukee's Erase and Replace program, founded by Wisconsin State Representative Johnny Morris Tatum.
What we did with the grassroots movement, with the Tobacco Control Initiative, was we woke up the society about the targeting of tobacco use to minority children. And that was something everyone could rally around, because even people that smoked did not believe that children should be seduced into this type of behavior. And one of the things that helped propel was the national movement under tobacco control, when the information started coming out that yes, this was intentional, yes, children were being targeted, yes, they knew that this product was a product that caused cancer. Those grassroots movements were very instrumental in getting the country geared in a direction of having happen what we've seen happen in recent years, and that is bringing about accountability to the tobacco companies about who they sell their products to and how they advertise.
Still another program that has been expanded into a national model is Growing Power, founded by Will Allen.
Had gotten a call from Hunger Task Force, from the executive director, that a YWCA group wanted to start an organic garden, and they couldn't find anybody to help them, so she mentioned my name, and to make a long story short, I went and looked at the plot that they wanted to grow some produce on, and it was a little bit too small, so I donated a spot behind our greenhouses here on 55th and Silver Spring, and it was about in June. It was getting kind of late, and they grew some peppers and beans and tomatoes, and they had a pretty successful garden, and they got a call from the Milwaukee Journal, and the Journal sent out a writer and a photographer, and they did a pretty major story about urban kids growing organic produce and selling them at the Fondy Farmers Market, where I'm the president of co-op, and we gave them a stand there, and they sold their produce there and had a pretty successful project that first year. And from that article, I started getting calls from other groups throughout the city, schools, and other nonprofit organizations for me to set up similar projects for their kids to learn about where their food came from and how to grow food and that sort of thing.
And Milwaukee's Black community has often led the nation in educational reform.
Milwaukee, for a lot of different reasons, has become the educational mecca, not just of the United States, but of the world. The school choice program, which is the first in the country and the largest, with over 11,000 low-income children going to over 100 private schools, has become the centerpiece of reform in America. Charter schools with Dr. Howard Fuller have been a staple as we talk about how do we help improve educational options for the poor. But I think the most important piece of all of this leadership is that the parents have become empowered. And in Milwaukee, we're talking primarily about African American parents who today can choose any school in the city for their child, regardless of how much money they make.
Municipalities throughout the nation have been closely following these new Milwaukee models to consider them for their own educational goals. The Parental School Choice Program, founded by Wisconsin State Representative Polly Annette Williams, permits low-income families in Milwaukee to send their children to private schools of their choice. The cost is paid by the state.
Now you know just some of the contributions that African Americans have made. Let's see how much you can remember when you compete for baseball cards in Jeopardy!